In studio to debate the greening of our energy grid, Joyce McLean, Director of Strategic Issues for Toronto Hydro; Jatin Nathwani, Executive Director of the University of Waterloo's Institute for Sustainable Energy; Jose Echeverry of York University's Environmental Studies Program; and Tom Adams, Energy and Environment Advisor. Good to have all of you alongside for tonight's discussion. I should let you know, just by way of background, that 1 week ago tonight, we had in those seats people who had a burning passion to talk about nuclear power issues, and we had a debate about the advisability of spending tens of billions of dollars in this province on new nukes. This is the companion program to that, insofar as we want you here to talk about whether or not we don't have to do that, whether conservation and maybe energy efficiency can get us where we need to be without doing that. So, to that end, sitting in that chair was Duncan Hawthorne, who runs Bruce Power, one of the biggest nuclear players in this province. And here's what he had to say about our current reliance on nuclear power. Roll tape.
50% of Ontario today is powered by nuclear plants, CANDU plants. All of those plants will need to be refurbished or replaced. So there's people like to put a big $1 billion number on this, but the reality is that we have to decide, if not nuclear and not these CANDU plants, then what's a credible alternative?
Okay, let's put that, Joyce McLean, to you first. Government wants to spend tens of billions of dollars on new nuclear technology. If you took that money and you put it into renewables or something else instead, what would be the effect?
Well, I think the effect first would be a massive reshift in how we think about electricity and energy and how we power our homes and businesses, which I think is where we're at. We're at the cusp of that thinking right now. Certainly from Toronto Hydro's perspective, we think that conservation is the first principle, and we should be focusing on making sure that people are conserving the most they can and that our homes and businesses are run as efficiently as possible. And we would like to see the money spent there first and foremost.
Jatin Nathwani, if you spent those tens of billions of dollars on greener power, could you do what we need to do to keep the lights on?
I'm afraid not. I think nuclear has to be an essential part of the mix. Having said that, the direction that we're on, which is an increasing role for both renewable energy resources in the province of Ontario, as well as the focus on conservation, is about right. But given that coal is exit, we will need nuclear for some time to come because of the role it plays in the reliability of the system.
Jose, what do you say?
Well, until the 1960s, we called it hydro for a reason. It came from hydropower. Now it provides 25% of the mix. We can develop renewables to have a very important part of the mix, and we can have combined heat and power and district heating, which is what countries like Denmark are doing, and we can have a very different system, one that is green, good for the pocketbooks of Ontarians, and good for the environment.
So if you spent those tens of billions on renewables instead of nuclear power, you could still keep the lights on?
Totally, and this is a 21st century system that we should have in this country and in this province.
Tom Adams, what do you say?
We got some tough choices. I don't think this is going to be easy. Some parts are easy. We've got to, I think there's very wide acceptance within the industry that we've got to improve our grid. We've got to smarten up our grid. That can make a lot of difference. And we are making progress on conservation. The consumption is going down, but the long-term trajectory, probably for flat load, is something that we've got to deal with.
Can I just jump in? What do you mean smarten up the grid?
Well, we have, when we built the power grid, and over time, over about 100 years, it was a system that was really designed passively. The customer was out there being served. The customer was really not an active part of the system. They were a recipient for power. There was very little coming back from the customer. A green grid that has information and potentially electricity flowing back and forth between the customer and the people that are producing and transmitting, distributing power. There's a lot of opportunity there to manage the whole system better, so that renewables fit better, so that conservation works better. My point is, there are a lot of good things we can do, but it doesn't get us away from some tough decisions. If coal and nuclear is out, we're talking about a lot of gas.
Well, I got it right here. Let's put this up, Michael. Here's the next graphic we want to show everybody. Look at the monitors here in the studios. Here's Ontario's generating capacity right now. We can do over 35,000 megawatts, and here's how. We heard Duncan Hawthorne at the top of the program say half is nuclear. Some people say a third. We're going with the more conservative figure, but somewhere between a third and a half is nuclear. Oil and gas about a quarter, hydro about 22%, coal, that's the other one we're trying to phase out by 2014, 18%, wind only 3% at the moment, and other less than 1%. Jose, if we are trying to phase out coal by 2014, and you don't like nuclear, is it realistic to assume that we can replace more than half of what we rely on today to keep the lights on and people working and factories moving and so on and so forth without nuclear?
Well, we need to think differently, of course, and we need to start investing seriously. So the government in Ontario has done some right things. For example, the Green Energy Act, the feed-in tariffs for renewable that are soon going to be reality. And what we need to do is we need to emulate what is working in other countries that are at the forefront of this. And I mentioned earlier Denmark. Denmark, with a population half the size of Ontario, consumes about a quarter of the power that we do here. And that is because they've taken over the, I don't know, last 20, 30 years, steps to ensure that economic growth, it's no longer associated with a growth on energy use. That's one thing they did, and it's only 2 countries in the world.
Small country, though. Well, tiny, small country compared to here.
But there's only 2 countries that have done it. Japan and Denmark have been able to dissociate GDP with the growth of energy. That's number 1. Number 2, they made it mandatory that district heating had to be part of the way people heated their homes. And what this did was that it created an incentive to create combined heat and power plants. So what they do is they locate combined heat and power plants close to where the power is used and where the heat is used, because heat can be stored for a long time, you see. And then you can have a large penetration of intermittent renewables like wind. In Denmark at the moment, the mix is 26% it's wind, and they aim to do 40%, Steve.
Okay, but Joyce, Tom said a moment ago, we got some very tough decisions we have to make here.
Yes.
And I guess the toughest decision is, can you really take coal and nuclear out of our energy mix and replace it with renewables and keep the lights on?
Well, I think the point is that it's over time. I don't think you could just decide that tomorrow and shut everything down and hope that the lights are going to stay on. That's not realistic. But I think that if we made decisions based on the actual cost of the technology and helped educate the average consumer and business owner, then I think that we would have a groundswell of support for renewables as the base for moving forward. And if we were in fact to change our codes so that all appliances and other equipment were at the highest possible efficiency rating, which is not the case, not even close to the case now, then we would see a sea shift happen. I mean, as Jose alluded to, we are very wasteful in Canada in terms of our energy consumption. We're still wasteful. Despite the incentives and investments that have been made in Ontario thus far, we're still very wasteful as a society, and we can do a lot more on the conservation front. And that's the cheapest form of electricity going.
Conserving.
Yes.
Jatin.
As I said, it's, I think, not realistic nor credible. It fails a number of key tests, something along the lines of cost. Cost matters. Affordability of reliable, cheap supply of power to the people is absolutely necessary, particularly if you think about the socially disadvantaged.
You saying nuclear, though, is a...
Well, the cost of power delivered to the people of Ontario, and you've got to get the right mix here.
The cost of nuclear is off the charts, though, isn't it?
It is not, if you take a balanced view of the matter. We'll get back to that cost in a moment. But let me give you the 4 tests that you have to meet here. Cost matters. Mm-hmm. Reliability of that power system is also important, because ultimately it deals with industry and economic growth. Commercial feasibility of the number of renewable energy options come into play. The notion of environmental sustainability and social acceptance is also another key feature. And if I were to take you above all that to a vision of Ontario, where if you saw this society decline in terms of depopulation, that would be one thing, but you will have 3 more million Ontarians in the year 20 years from now. Mm-hmm. This is a modern industrial province that requires a level of energy supply and a reliability that can only be achieved through a robust mix of supply options that ought to include a large amount of renewables and a great focus on conservation, but you can't get away without nuclear.
Tom, you want to follow?
when you looked at your pie, the hydro component of the pie was almost all constructed prior to 1968. Really, most of the big hydro was completed prior to 1955. There are a few hydroelectric opportunities in the far north. They're pretty expensive. We have to establish a good relationship with the Aboriginal people that are there.
Can I just understand, that 22% you think can be a lot bigger if we get into that?
It can be a little bit bigger, is my point. The coal and nuclear slice, if we take that out, and we're maintaining concern about reliability, as Jatine was making the point, cost and whatnot, renewables can take up a slice of it, but we're going to end up with a whole lot of gas. Now, right now, we have the favorable position of natural gas being a very inexpensive fuel. It gives us some breathing room, some time to think. It's easy to build gas plants. They're well, not that easy, but they're fairly quick to build. There's not a long lead time.
How are they on pollution?
Well, there's positives and negatives. They're a lot better than the old unscrubbed coal plants that we used to have. On the other hand, if you look at upstream, their emissions and you look at the whole life cycle, their pollution is better, but still not perfect.
Jose, do you want to talk about those 4 tests that Jatine said? Cost, reliability, commercial feasibility, environmental sustainability. Does your program meet that test?
All of the above, and most importantly, let's talk about what matters most to Ontarians, which is money and jobs. This is the economy of the 21st century. It's based on sustainability and renewable energy and
nuclear
conservation.
creates lots of jobs too, so.
Well, not really. I mean, if you put it on a table, in any measure that you put on dollar invested or megawatt hour, the jobs are with renewable energy and conservation. They're labor intensive, they're not capital intensive. The point of the story, though, is that this is an opportunity. Say if you have a town of 10,000 people here in Ontario. Each family 10,000 families. Each family is spending $5,000 per year on energy costs to keep their house going, their car going, etc. Well, that's over 1 year, $50 million. And over 10 years, $500 million, billion with a B as in Bob. And this is, how can we find a way that that money that at the moment is going to buy fossil fuels, to buy uranium, not from us here in Ontario, but from other people outside, and to top it all off, creating pollution, how can we keep that huge amount of money for 10,000 families
inside the country? Tom,
in Ontario?
Look, a couple of issues here. In Denmark, household customers are paying almost 40 cents a kilowatt hour Canadian for power, which is about almost 4 times what we're paying here on average. That's an issue. Another issue is this green jobs business. The electricity industry is extremely capital intensive. The renewables are very capital intensive. These wind power farms that are being set up, there's not a lot of people working there. You don't see a lot of pickup trucks in the parking lots.
There's a bunch of folks who don't want them near where they live either.
Well, there are some social acceptability issues if we cite them, without being careful. But electricity is not a place that's going to create a lot of jobs. The people that work in the power business are well paid, they're highly trained, there's a lot of experts, but there are not that many of them. And there ought not to be. We don't want a labor-intensive power system, we want an efficient power system.
Let me pick up on that. And Joyce, I want to bring you in here. We hear these terms occasionally used interchangeably, and I'm not sure they ought to be, so maybe you can help us with an explanation here. The difference between efficiency and conservation. Go on.
Okay. Well, efficiency has to do with the ability of the equipment that you're using to run in the most efficient, least energy intensive way. So for instance, there is a consumer program called Energy Star that rates your fridges and those kinds of things out there. So those, and the idea is the lower the kilowatt hours, the better for you as a consumer to purchase. And the government, the Ontario government, unfortunately, just let a program lapse where you got a rebate on basically a relief on your tax if you bought an Energy Star appliance. Conservation is really about behavior, though, and that's a really critical component. And that requires education, information lots of material for people to grasp this notion. And to Tom's point, you know, about cost, I mean, it is true that Europeans pay a lot more money for their electricity, and therefore they use a lot less.
Yeah,
and
sure.
This is a really critical point. And if we were in fact looking at the total cost of production from nuclear, coal, other forms of electricity generation, we would be paying a different price structure than we're currently paying now. And I think that's a really important consideration when you are looking at moving equipment into a more efficient realm and talking to people about how they actually use electricity in their homes and businesses and whether they're leaving their lights on.
I want to pick up on all that
sort
right
of
now
thing.
because we got, Jatino, go to you in 1 second. We got a graphic here, Michael, if we can bring this one up. Electricity demand in the province of Ontario. 2 lines here. Going back to 1975 to present day. Here's the line where we thought electricity use was going. Up until about 1989, then that recession of 1990 kicked in. Here's what actually happened. So the smart people who plan to make sure that we have enough capacity in the system thought we were going to be way up the charts. And in fact, what ended up happening was that line kind of flattened out much more dramatically than they thought. Now, Tom, we did lose 300,000 jobs over the last few years. There's no doubt that's part of the explanation. Maybe part of the explanation is conservation as well. Maybe part of the explanation is industry has gotten more energy efficient. Is that possible too?
Yeah, it's happened across industry. You look at mining, forestry. Actually, you look at the entire industrial sector and compare their efficiency against the other major sectors, commercial, industrial, and residential. It's been the industrial customer class that's made the greatest progress in efficiency. It's not all been what they call load destruction when plants have been shutting down, although that's been a factor in recent years. But the trend for improvement in energy efficiency is a long-term trend, and industry's been carrying their load.
Jatine.
The point about energy efficiency is valid and good in that it reduces real cost of what it is that you do. One ought to still be quite wary and aware of a perverse phenomenon called the rebound effect, that the more efficient you make things, in fact, because you have reduced real cost, that the actual aggregate utilization in the economy of that particular form of energy does go up. So these are perverse effects that you need to be aware of as you plan for these things. If I may also touch upon the question.
Can I just, before you leave that thought, the best example there might be the car. They made more energy efficient, and as a result, people bought more gas and drove more.
That's one example cited. So it is something to be quite aware of and not ignored as you think about the future and trying to meet the needs in some sort of a robust way that you won't find yourself.
Now you wanted to follow up.
The follow-up was around conservation. Of course, it makes absolute and eminent sense. How can we not do more of it? But why can't we also be more realistic about its potential? In Ontario, the early results are pretty good, and it seems quite credible that it's something we should pursue. It comes at a cost also, which is very low. So that is something that we should pursue. But look out for saturation effects. Look out for things where you need to monitor these things fairly closely over time to ensure that the results will in fact stick. And ultimately, it's not a substitute for supply. What it does do is it introduces a great deal of flexibility into the planning system. So now the fact that you have more conservation, it relaxes the constraints on the planning.
Okay, let me pick up on that. Jose, if you look at that chart and you see you expected energy use to go like this, and in fact it went like this, are you going to use that as an argument to say, look, we don't need to build all this new capacity. We're going to be fine, just nipping at the edges a bit?
I didn't expect it. I actually think we can do much better. The point of the story is the difference between conservation and efficiency. It's behavior. And the culture of conservation that the government started to build has to become an ingrained part of the educational system of our province, the same as renewable energy. Look, the bottom line here is that to have a better province, you have to plan to have it. And you have to create opportunities so farmers, community groups, forestry operations, and the manufacturing sector can get a piece of the action. The piece of the action I described it earlier, there's this significant amount of money that we use to power our homes, to heat our homes, and at the moment is exporting capital away from our province. And the key thing here is how to ensure that we develop the local conditions so we can become really, really good at efficiency, that's making things better, putting sweaters in homes, making better windows, and creating power in the home, the business, and close to industry.
Well, that's just it. Joyce, how do you make sure that people, when they say, oh, well, these cars are energy efficient right now, that we don't go out and drive more and use more gas and defeat the whole purpose of the whole thing in the first place?
Well, to put it in context, since 2005, Toronto Hydro's incentive programs have reduced the load off the Toronto Hydro grid by about 370 megawatts. And we know that that's basically easy activities, but at the same time...
Like what?
Light bulb changeouts, okay? But even so, you look around, you go to restaurants, you go to businesses, you go to people's homes, people are still using a lot of incandescent bulbs, which are much more energy intensive than compact fluorescents, as an example. So even though we've made some headway, we know we've barely touched the surface of the potential for conservation. So again, I come back to Jose's point about education, about information, about ingraining this in people's brains, about, you know, that this is, we're talking about larger consequences. When we're talking about electricity generation, there are environmental consequences, there are societal consequences as a result of decisions that we make now that are going to last for many, many, many years. And I think that if we were better educated as consumers, we would be choosing the clean air options, the no waste options, and the least cost options, which is conservation and renewables.
Tom, I guess the fear here is that planning, needless to say, is a very inexact science. And I think you and I were probably both at those press conferences almost 20 years ago now, when the, you know, the grand poobahs from Ontario Hydro came out and said, we need tons of new nuclear facilities in this province because look at what demand is going to do, and it never happened. Now, the other side of that is, you know, what if the economy picks up? And what if people start using more power? And what if 3 million people do, in fact, move here in the next 10 years? You don't want to be caught shortchanged, do you?
No. The power system has to kind of ride this knife edge. There's a lot of objectives that you're trying to optimize. And actually, you know, I've got a lot of sympathy for the people that have to make those decisions because getting it wrong has a lot of consequences.
You didn't have very much sympathy when you were with Energy Probe. You've changed a lot. You've mellowed in your old age, Tom.
You know, I've got some sense of humility about this subject. It's a tough subject. And it comes back to this theme, I think, that we don't have just a lot of silver bullets available to us. Jose was making a point about cogeneration. That's a great option. It's theoretically got a very large potential. But you look at the economics of cogeneration for industrial customers. We know there are several good opportunities for some incremental cogeneration. But for a lot of industry, it's very borderline. Then you start looking at, well, at smaller scales, some of these cogeneration plants, they're more expensive. The operating costs are higher. So the economics of cogeneration are really still quite dicey.
Jatine.
The key point I want to raise is we ought not to forget recent short memory here. 2003, we pretty well got to a pretty serious crisis in electricity supply in Ontario, and we had Mr. Dwight Duncan running around saying supply, supply, supply is the only answer, and then you can't bring these things on in a real hurry. So as you said, the planning of electricity supply is certainly not a science. There are one too many uncertainties here, and you don't want to head down a path with a whole set of untestable hypotheses and assumptions and wishful thinking that you think you might actually be able to deliver on the basis of, you know, assumptions that have not been tested out.
Part of the issue is we had a pretty moderate summer here. And the previous winter, actually, was a fairly moderate winter. And as a result, we didn't use as much power.
And a recession on top of that.
And a recession on top of that. So maybe usage is down for all of those reasons. Jose?
Key thing here is to learn from those that are doing things right. And the fact is that the European Union as a whole has a 2020 directive to increase the use of renewable energy, country by country, a great deal. Countries like Germany, Denmark, Spain, and so on are doing these things because they make sense for their economies. And the key thing here that I want to clarify is that building a large-scale centralized generation plant, be it coal or nuclear. It's a huge capital and time-intensive endeavor. Building capacity based on renewables and combined heat and power can be done in a more modular manner. In other words, you can put things closer to where they're needed. You go to Markham, Ontario, for example. In Markham, Ontario, they have combined heat and power plants at the moment that were built right in the area where the next downtown of Markham is going to be. And they're going to fire those generators and store the hot water to provide hot water to all the buildings that will be built there. That makes a great deal of sense.
I see lots of, everybody else wants in. Joyce, go ahead, you first.
Well, I think that it's really important to think about this kind of thing, that we have had large central plants in Ontario, and maybe it's time to look at a completely different model and do a decentralized model. So that what if, for instance, every house in Toronto had the opportunity to, as part of the chattel on the house, part of the mortgage, you actually have the ability to install a solar photovoltaic system on your house, so that when you leave that house, that system stays with the house and it becomes part of the asset that the house would provide to the next homeowner.
You can do that?
No bank wants to take that on right now, but it's something that, or no bank at least is publicly saying that they're taking that on right now, but I think it's certainly something that we could be considering. Just like when you move from house to house, the hot water, you don't take the hot water tank with you,
right.
But you could leave the solar system that you've invested in with the house as an example. I mean, that is true decentralized power. Having solar on your rooftop that basically serves your own purposes.
Tom.
We've got a lot of uncertainties. We're not sure what the technology of the future is going to be that's going to work best. So we need some no regrets solutions, things that give us flexibility going forward.
One of the things,
invest in the grid. The grid's a provincial resource. If we do, we've made technological breakthroughs in Ontario before. Back in the 50s, we were some of the first people to put in a 500 kV system. It really worked. People didn't think it was going to work. It did. We can do it again.
So you're saying invest in transmission?
Put some money into making a smarter transmission system, not necessarily a bigger transmission system, one that works better. It'll give us flexibility to bring in the technology of the future.
Jatin.
The point I wanted to make about renewables energy sources is that there's a fundamental mismatch, apart from the fact that it is costly and it is an intermittent source of energy. There's a fundamental mismatch in terms of the power density that renewable energy resources that flow through and the power density of the demand in terms of whether it's in a house, office, or industry. Mm-hmm. And as you begin to increase the range of renewables in the system, your impacts on land use begin to increase enormously that you had not predicted. The amount of social friction that begins to show up around wind that we're beginning to see that you had not predicted. So the point to make is each form of energy has its limitations and its strength, and you need to try and strive something that actually makes the entire system work in some coherence. Let's
do one more graphic here. We got about 5.5 minutes to go, and this is called the 6,300 megawatt target. These are the targets the Ontario Power Authority hopes that we're going to hit. In 2006, Ontario set a target of reducing peak demand by 6,300 megawatts through conservation and efficiency through to the year 2025. That would be equal to taking 1 in 5 users off the grid. That's a big target. A reduction of 1,300 plus megawatts has been seen to date. Okay, these targets, Tom, at all realistic?
In some ways, you got to take these things a little bit with a grain of salt, I think. When we're talking about megawatts or power generated or power consumed, there's a meter on the generating station. There's a meter on the house. You can tell how much who's producing and where it's being consumed. But when you're talking about avoided consumption, how much gasoline didn't you use today? Could you have used but you didn't? Or electricity or some other resource, it's very tough to tell. These numbers, I think, look, conservation is a legitimate objective, and the fact that we've been keeping our per capita consumption really quite flat for quite a while, actually declining in recent years, that's a step in the right direction. but I mean, 6,300 megawatts.
Jose, let me go to you on this. The World Wildlife Fund, offices just down the street, pretty green organization. They think, never mind 6,300, they think 9 to 12,000 megawatts as a target for reduction is possible. Is it possible we're not being ambitious enough?
I completely agree, and I think the viewers have to go to the internet and look at energynet.dk. That's the
energynet.dk for Denmark.
That's for Denmark. And that's, you will see a nice graph of how that country deals with its electricity on a minute-by-minute, day-by-day basis. And as I said earlier, half the population of Ontario using a quarter of the power and getting 26% from the wind right now and wanting to get, as a policy of the government, 40% by the year 2020.
So should we quadruple the cost of power?
Well, I don't think it's
get people
necessary.
to use less, wouldn't it?
Well, but why be so blunt about it? What I want to see more is to see a new system that benefits directly Ontario farmers, as Joyce was saying, Ontario homeowners. And I have a very good example. In our house, we put a solar water heater. Manufactured in Waterloo, where Jatine comes from, it now reduces the use of fossil fuel in my house for the hot waters by 40%. It was made by Ontarians, installed by Ontarians, and the natural gas that I'm saving, the atmosphere is thanking me.
Let's talk about timing. This is a lousy time. No one has to be told that, right? People are focused on the economy. They're focused on, if you've got a job, keeping a job. If you don't have a job, trying to find a job. Can you talk to people in the province of Ontario today about conservation and efficiency when they are so overwhelmingly focused on the economy?
Absolutely, because they are critical hand-in-hand elements. You want the economy to flourish, you need to be operating at the least cost possible, and that includes being the most efficient you possibly can.
But that takes an upfront investment too, doesn't it?
Yes, it does, but it pays back. And you know, I think that we need to consider how businesses and homeowners look at that payback period, because we know it's a challenge at Toronto Hydro in talking to our commercial customers who want a payback period of 2 years. We think that's unrealistic. I mean, if you're going to be in business for a period of time, you should be able to spread out your costs of investment over a longer period than 2 years. We know that the average homeowner will look at an 8-year sort of payback. That's more realistic. And if you're going to be in business for the long haul, you should be looking at that as a reasonable rate of, a reasonable way of a time frame of investing.
Okay, Jatine?
To comment on whether these targets are reasonable or not, and how do you measure them, and can you actually measure them meaningfully, are all challenging questions. But let me bring one more in. Let's assume we can actually meet the conservation targets and do better than we thought we would. The other key factor that you need to recognize in the Ontario system today is that the system is aging. Large amounts of the capacity of Ontario's generation assets are going out of service. And now if you throw on top of that you are not going to do nuclear, or either refurbish or build some new ones, and take coal out, you're putting the province in a degree of jeopardy that you wouldn't wish to be a Minister of Energy 10 years from now.
Minute to go, Tom. Tell me this. Do you think we have the capacity to change? I've heard it around this table many times. Ontarians are energy pigs. Do we have the capacity to change the way they think about using energy?
We've already made great progress. You know, the trend line, the improvement in energy efficiency in Ontario that's gone on in the last few years started before the economy crashed. So it's not just the economic turndown. We can make progress on the culture of conservation.
Last 30 seconds, Jose.
Ontario should be proud of itself. This is the only jurisdiction in the world that is trying to phase out coal. We have the best renewable energy plants and systems in North America at the moment, and we need to keep doing more. This is going to put Ontarians to work, so let's get on with this.
And when in doubt, call Denmark, because they know what they're doing.
And we can be the Scandinavia of the Americas.
We can be the Danes of Canada. Okay. Can I thank, on one side of the table, Joyce McLean from Toronto Hydro, Jose Echeverry from York University. On the other side of the table, Tom Adams, the Energy and Environment Advisor, formerly with Energy Probe, Jatine Nathwani, University of Waterloo. I thank all four of you for coming in tonight and helping us with this discussion. Thanks so much.
Thank you.